Gabriel Capone, better known as Al Capone, was one of the most infamous gangsters in American history. Born in Brooklyn, New York in 1899 to immigrant parents, Capone quickly rose from the streets to become the undisputed king of organized crime in Chicago. His ruthless business acumen and violent enforcement method helped him amass a fortune in the Prohibition era, running bootlegging operations, speakeasies, and a criminal empire that thrived off illegal gambling, prostitution, and corruption. But despite his notoriety and the countless murders linked to his name, Capone managed to stay one step ahead of the law for nearly a decade. His influence spread like wildfire, not only among criminals, but also within the highest levels of local politics and law enforcement. For years, the authorities couldn't touch him. How did Al Capone, a man so publicly associated with crime and violence, evade capture for so long? Early years in crime. Al Capone's path to power began with small-time gang affiliations in Brooklyn. It wasn't long before he caught the attention of Johnny Torrio, a powerful Chicago mobster. Capone relocated to Chicago in the early 1920s and quickly became Torrio's right-hand man. When Torrio was seriously wounded in an assassination attempt, he handed control of his criminal empire to Capone. Capone wasted no time solidifying his dominance, using his brutal enforcement tactics to eliminate rivals. His network of bribes, political connections, and assassinations meant that any witness who dared to testify against him could mysteriously disappear. Or worse, the streets ran with blood during gang wars, yet Capone maintained an image of a legitimate businessman to many. To the public, he was often seen as a generous figure, giving to charities and portraying himself as a modern-day Robin Hood. Prohibition and empire building. The Volstead Act of 1920, which ushered in prohibition, was a golden opportunity for Capone. While alcohol was illegal, the demand for it never waned, and Capone seized this opportunity. By running massive bootlegging operations, he controlled the flow of liquor into Chicago and beyond, making millions in profit every year. He also controlled hundreds of speakeasies, secret nightclubs where illegal liquor was sold. Yet Capone's empire wasn't limited to just alcohol. He had a hand in prostitution rings, gambling dens, and extortion rackets. His wealth and influence were staggering, and despite the obvious illegality of his activities, Capone proved remarkably difficult to prosecute. This was not just because of his criminal genius, but because of his strategic corruption. He kept the police on his payroll, ensuring that raids were tipped off before they even started. Judges and politicians were bribed, and witnesses were silenced through fear or financial incentive. It seemed that the law, at least in Chicago, was powerless against him, Capone's public image, and escalating violence. But while Capone controlled the underworld, he also mastered the art of manipulating the media. He frequently courted journalists who dubbed him Scarface, due to the distinct scar on his face, a result of a fight in his youth. To the public, Capone's lavish lifestyle and flamboyant personality made him a celebrity of sorts, and his charitable contributions helped craft an image of a man who cared for the poor. However, behind this carefully curated image lay a brutal criminal who had no hesitation in using violence to maintain his power. Today's sponsor is AmericanTaxService. Since their inception in 2017, they have helped clients legally avoid nearly $1 billion in taxes. Whether you or your business owes the IRS, wants to leverage the knowledge of up-to-date CPAs to save as much money as possible, properly structure their business or personal asset entities to protect their assets, or just want someone to handle their taxes, ATS is there for you. Click the link in the description below for a free consultation and regain financial freedom and peace of mind. Remember, folks, unlike Al Capone, you don't need a Tommy gun to protect your assets. Just reach out to American Tax Service, your one-stop shop for all of your tax resolution and asset protection needs. Click the link in the description to get your free consultation today, or scan this QR code. And as a special bonus, ATS is offering an exclusive ebook, How to Legally Pay $0 in Taxes, which is available for free. Just enter your email and it will send straight to your inbox. Now back to the video. One of the most notorious events linked to Capone was the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where 7 rival gang members were gunned down in cold blood by men dressed as police officers. Though the massacre was shocking and garnered massive media attention, Capone again evaded direct criminal charges. Despite being suspected of orchestrating numerous murders and running a vast criminal organization, Capone was never directly tied to any of the more violent activities. The lack of willing witnesses, along with his constant bribes to law enforcement, kept him safe. The elusive nature of prosecution. Local law enforcement repeatedly found itself at a loss. Capone was always ahead of the game, surrounded by a wall of bodyguards and protected by a network of corruption that made any investigation into his dealings a dead end. Even federal agents struggled. The FBI, then known as the Bureau of Investigation, pursued him for years but lacked the legal grounds to bring him down for his most serious crimes. Capone's uncanny ability to dodge criminal charges boiled down to his mastery of legal loopholes and the sheer breadth of his bribery network. His illegal empire was vast, but it was so well oiled that very little could be tied directly back to him. Every operation had layers of intermediaries and cutouts, ensuring that Capone himself remained insulated from the evidence. Even when he was arrested, it was often for minor offenses that led to quick releases, frustrating federal authorities. The IRS steps in. Enter Frank Wilson. But as Capone's criminal empire seemed untouchable, a less glamorous branch of the government began taking a keen interest in his finances, the Internal Revenue Service. One man in particular, Frank J. Wilson, a forensic accountant with the IRS, took on the task of bringing Capone down, not for his bootlegging, gambling, or murders, but for something as simple as tax evasion. Wilson led a small but determined team of investigators who meticulously combed through Capone's financial records. At the time, Capone never bothered to file income tax returns. His wealth was generated through illegal activities, and he thought himself untouchable. Wilson and his team, however, uncovered evidence that despite not filing taxes, Capone had been living lavishly and spending extravagantly. By piecing together ledgers, bank records, and testimony from accountants and business owners, Wilson was able to build a case against Capone based on his undeclared income. After years of fruitless attempts by other law enforcement agencies, it was the IRS and its quiet, methodical investigation that proved Capone's undoing. The trial and downfall.
The gangsters is about to be taken for a ride by your Uncle Sammy. It's moving day for Scarface Al Capone. The camera boys are all ready, so look sharp. Here he comes. That's Al, wearing the big white hat. Seems to be in a hurry, but where he's going, he'll have time and nothing but. And none of the good citizens of Chicago is exactly weeping about it.
In 1931, Al Capone was indicted on 22 counts of federal income tax evasion. Capone, confident as ever, thought he could bribe or intimidate his way out of the charges. But Frank Wilson's team had built an airtight case, and Capone's attempts to influence the jury were thwarted when the judge swapped out the jury at the last moment to prevent tampering. Capone's sentencing and imprisonment. After his conviction for tax evasion in 1931, Al Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. At the time, it was one of the longest sentences ever handed down for tax evasion, signaling the federal government's desire to make an example out of Capone, whose notorious criminal empire had evaded prosecution for years. Capone was initially sent to the U.S. penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. However, even behind bars, his influence was apparent. Capone lived comfortably, receiving special privileges from the prison staff who were bribed by his associates. He maintained a luxurious lifestyle compared to other inmates, enjoying good food, special visitors, and a degree of autonomy. But this didn't last long. In 1934, authorities, aware of Capone's continued influence within the prison system, decided to transfer him to the newly established Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, a maximum security prison located on an island in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz was designed to break the most hardened criminals, with strict isolation and a complete cutoff from the outside world. For Capone, the transfer marked the beginning of his true downfall. Capone's time at Alcatraz. Capone was stripped of his power. The prison's strict rules and high level of security meant that he could no longer bribe guards or receive special treatment. He became just another inmate, subject to the same harsh conditions as everyone else. For a man who once commanded an empire, this was a dramatic fall from grace. It was during his time at Alcatraz that Capone's health began to rapidly deteriorate. He had contracted syphilis years earlier, likely during his time as a young man involved in prostitution rings. Left untreated for too long, the disease had begun to affect his brain. By the mid-1930s, Capone was showing signs of neurosyphilis, suffering from symptoms such as confusion, memory loss, and paranoia. His mental state began to decline, and he became a shadow of his former self. While Capone did manage to stay out of trouble for the most part, he occasionally clashed with other inmates, including one incident where he was stabbed with a pair of scissors. However, it was his deteriorating health that ultimately led to his early release. Release and final days. In 1939, after serving about 7.5 years of his 11-year sentence, Capone was released from Alcatraz. Due to his declining mental and physical health, he was transferred first to a mental hospital in Baltimore and later to his mansion on Palm Island, Florida, where he spent the remainder of his life. Capone's final years were marked by illness and isolation. The once feared gangster now lived a quiet and secluded life, no longer the powerful figure who had terrorized Chicago for years. His syphilis had advanced to the point where he had the mental capacity of a child, and his memory and cognitive abilities were severely impaired. Capone spent his days with his family, occasionally fishing in the waters near his estate, but having little interaction with the outside world. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died of cardiac arrest at the age of 48. The official cause of death was complications from a stroke and pneumonia, but his long battle with syphilis had taken a serious toll on his health in the years leading up to his death. Conclusion: Al Capone's final years were a far cry from his heyday as the kingpin of organized crime. The man who had once commanded armies of gangsters and ruled the underworld of Chicago was ultimately broken by imprisonment and illness. Despite being guilty of innumerable violent crimes, including murders and orchestrating ruthless gang wars, Capone's vast network of corruption made it impossible for law enforcement to convict him on those charges. His bribery of politicians, police officers, and even judges ensured that any serious criminal cases against him would crumble. In the end, it was the meticulous work of the IRS, spearheaded by Frank Wilson, that finally led to his downfall. Not for his violent or criminal enterprises, but for the simple crime of tax evasion. Capone's legacy endures as a cautionary tale of how even the most untouchable criminals can be brought down, not just by the law, but by the relentless diligence of those who refuse to give up.